Sports and government. Sports subsidies for civic interests?
Most of what goes on in sport goes on off the playing field.
It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
The layers of government and the multiple levels of sports competition create a mosaic of relationships between sports and governments. From the local support of school and club sports to the national support of international Olympic sports, sports and government often find themselves working together. Olympic success can reinforce national pride, and government support can provide athletic opportunities. But what is the proper role of government in sports? Should government provide monopoly protection to certain sports interests to facilitate the growth of sports? Should municipalities provide subsidies for privately owned sports franchises to remain in or to go to their locality? How should we manage the relationship of government and sports? These are some of the questions addressed at the summit, the first international conference on ethics in sports. Let's revisit the summit and consider some of the ideas presented there.
Suppose I told you 16 years ago that I had a plan, that I could bring 5 to 6 million people to downtown Cleveland. These would be largely whites who would come to an area of city that was long abandoned by Anglos. It would create not integration, but at least racial mixing. But if we were willing to do that, it was going to cost every household in Cuyahoga County $50 for the next 30 years. Now, are you willing to do that? And if people said yes, and they may well have said yes, then we would have built the facility. But the notion that it has any kind of economic impact, it does redistribute a certain amount of consumption spending. But remember, when people don't go to football games or baseball games, they spend their money someplace else in the economy. So we're rearranging the deck chairs. And in Cleveland's case, if you live in the city of Cleveland, it's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, because still 52% of the residents of the city of Cleveland do not make salaries that equal the poverty line. So whether or not Cleveland's taxpayers ought to have done this is a question that Cleveland's taxpayers have to answer if it's asked in the appropriate framework.
In the Green Bay model, the only reason the Green Bay model works is the sharing of revenue. If we're not sharing 86% of revenue, Green Bay, public ownership or no public ownership, cannot exist. Obviously, could not exist in the baseball model. That is a certainty. But I think when you talk about trust and you talk about moral implications, I think there is some moral implications to the stadium issue, and I think we all understand what they are. I think in our case, we were in a situation where we had a lease that provided that we could leave at any point in time we wanted, and we could pay a set fee. It was about $1.8 million a year, and we had about 4 years left on our lease, so we're talking about a very small payment when it comes to relocation. And in reality, our owner took the position that ethically, he had a duty to this town, to this community, to say, hey, let's give you the last best shot. Let's put it in the form you want. Because initially it was going to be a restaurant tax. That was the form they wanted it in, to try to tax those people that were directly going to benefit from the stadium. Then it was going to be a hotel tax. Then it was going to be a car rental tax, all of which failed in the legislature. Then it was going to be done just by the county. And then they wanted it in the form of a referendum. And what our owner basically did was say, hey, we're not going to sign anything or do anything until that last best shot has been taken. And in that, we passed up a deal that was a very nice deal in a city up in Maryland that somebody else panicked and took. But we felt like that ethically and morally, and he emphasized it 1,000,000 times, we are going to give them that voting opportunity. Ours was a peculiar case, though, because we had a referendum that was very controversial. It involved education, and it involved police, and it involved infrastructure, and it was a half-cent tax. Those two had been on the ballot before and got destroyed. 65 against, 35 in favor, both the police and schools. And obviously the elderly population voted it down resoundingly. Then we had our referendum that involved us and those, and obviously it passed because it was the largest voter turnout in the history of this county, and a lot of the, when you look at the demographics, the younger people came out and voted yes. So still very controversial and argued about all the time. To this day, I can't go anywhere where we don't talk about it. But we felt like morally, and it's hard to say, we did the best we could do in that regard.
But you mentioned the idea of a restaurant tax and a car rental tax and hotel tax. That seems to become very prevalent, where you have these hidden taxes that folks aren't aware of when they come into a town. You're taxing people who, in many cases, aren't using these facilities. In Atlanta, I think there's a 3% tax on car rentals now to finance the new basketball arena. There's a 5% tax on the Georgia Dome, which is a football stadium. How ethical is that to be taxing people who aren't going to use these facilities, and is that proper or right, I guess is the question I have. That's for the...
I don't know. I go to New York all the time, and
the taxes are prohibitive.
I've always been told that your room rate's $175, and when I leave, it's usually about $240
right.
when you get done with the taxes. In fact, you made one phone call for $25. So I'm not certain about hidden taxes and how you justify them. But I would say to you that economically, what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, hey, this industry does get a benefit, and we're going to try in some way to do really what the economists may argue, which is try to shift a little of the burden to those people that do receive some residual benefit.
There's no.
Yeah, but the guy that rents the car at the airport is not going to the basketball arena.
There's no real clean tax. I mean, there's no way that you can put a tax on and have it designed explicitly for the individuals that are going to use the stadium, with the exception of putting a tax actually on the tickets,
which is what we did. That's correct. That's all you can do. But then the question becomes is how much of a tax do you put it on, and to the extent you put it on too much, then in essence all you've done is had the owner find a way to himself finance the stadium.
And basically what you're saying when you do that is you're taking a given price and you're just taking part of the price and just directly turning it over to the municipality. Now, the other thing here I would note is we're looking at a question of, I hate to sound like I'm one note going back and looking at what the cost and the benefits, but simply from a perspective of financing the relative costs, to a large extent, I mean, you're totally correct when you say you have zoning variances, you have general tax abatements that go to a variety of firms for a variety of different reasons with a variety of degrees of legitimacy. But the final analysis in terms of sports is that the sum total of all the economic benefits is less than the costs imposed on the community. And then the implication of that is in order for it to be a positive project for the community, you have to count in the entertainment value, you have to count in the civic pride. Once you include the civic pride in the equation, then the question becomes, why should that leave when a city loses a team? Which brings you back to the question, eminent domain. Why can't a city take a team by eminent domain in order to retain the civic pride, the externalities associated with the team?
Let me just talk about taxes.
Let's wake up real quick, and then we're going to go to...
Okay, because in Indianapolis, it didn't work 100%. We did create a sports tax district, which taxes, gets close to where I think Mr. McKay wanted to go, that for the new facility for the Indiana Pacers, if you don't want to put any money into it, you actually can eat in a restaurant that is 1 block away from the district, and you won't pay for the state. But if you come into the restaurant within the very narrow district, we're not talking about a district that's huge. We're literally talking about a district that is 2 blocks wide and about 7 blocks long. So if you stay outside that, you can have no dollar and touch the arena.
In baseball, it was with 80 home games. Today, you cannot, an individual cannot own their own stadiums. We could own our own stadiums in the early 80s for some various reasons. Principally, our tax laws changed in 1986. We had a dramatic impact on what you could do with those kind of venues. And then, of course, with the escalation of costs. So, in all fairness, gentlemen of the panel, economics will not permit an owner today, unless he just wants to, has tremendous resources to build their own stadium.
But the forces that create that, are arguable. But you cannot today, in a very rare case, can it be done. Obviously, Jack Kent Cooke just did it in Washington, but I again go back to saying that in reality he didn't, because as much as it's argued that it's privately financed, I think the infrastructure subsidy was as much as $50 to $60 million. So it wasn't as if he did it himself, and he went into a marketplace, and a pre-sold marketplace that we would all like to go into.
But the Indianapolis Colts faced a problem that we cannot generate enough in-stadium revenue to match the in-stadium revenue that teams get in other areas. And so we have to, in a sense, raise our taxes, which we did, so that we will give the Colts more money in an effort that they will have similar in-stadium revenues, because the NFL has decided that while they want to be a cartel and while they've made commitments to the U.S. Congress that they have systematically violated for more than 20 years, they will not share in-stadium revenue. Now you might say, well, if they're sharing the TV contract, doesn't that help the owner of the Indianapolis Colts? And as I came to the defense of the owner of the Indianapolis Colts and said, no matter what that new contract is, which is in excess of $73 million, with about 62/3 of that going to the players, the rising tide differential between him and Jerry Jones didn't change. Dallas still gets more money. San Francisco still gets more money. We just don't have it in our economy. So we raised our taxes. And this gets to the last point. When you say, are there intangible benefits from professional sports? The answer is yes.
The relationship among sports and government is complex, and the economic benefits are difficult to quantify. In the midst of political and economic uncertainties, government support of sports continues. Professor Mark Rosentraub, author of Major League Losers, The Real Costs of Sports and Who's Paying for It, argues that local public investment in sports franchises and stadiums simply redistributes local consumption spending. Sports investments do not create wealth in cities, but it does create intangible benefits for the city, such as goodwill and publicity. But the intangible public benefits are not controlled by the municipality. They are controlled by the franchise owner, who may remove the franchise and the intangible benefits when it serves the owner's interests. Mike Fish, a national award-winning investigative reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, raises questions about the appropriate use of hidden taxes, tourist, hotel, rental car taxes, and so on, to finance sports. Rich McKay, general manager for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers football team, played a central role in obtaining a new publicly financed stadium for his team. He argues that they acted honorably and ethically in the way they negotiated and won the public referendum for the stadium. Hidden taxes are encountered in many locales, so they may be a viable method of financing sports. However, taxes on sports tickets, he believes, is simply a way to take money away from the team owner to pay for the stadium. Professor Sheehan, author of Keeping Score, The Economics of Big-Time Sports, argues that the city's intangible benefits from sports franchises should provide the municipality rights to compel teams to remain in their city. Frank Morsani, a participant in several major franchise purchase deals, believes that the days of individuals owning major sports teams are over, and that today only corporate ownership with public support makes economic sense in big-time sports. Many people support the principle that if everyone benefits, then everyone should pay. And if only some benefit, then only some should pay. But in public support for private sports, the distribution of public goods is uneven at best. How can the benefits and burdens of sports be justly distributed?
There are great intangible benefits. I live and die by the fate of the Indiana Pacers, and I get a very large intangible benefit when they win, and I get a very large intangible loss when they lose. Now, I should be charged for that, and this becomes the whole question about it. When you say, for example, that who benefits from the intangibles, it's those of us who sit around the sports coolers. It's those of us who live and die by the fate of our sports teams. We are the ones who ought to be charged for that benefit. Now, how can we charge those who get the intangible benefits? There's any number of ways. We're the ones who consume it through television and radio. There can be access fees to looking at that kind of notion. The problem with the model that the four major sports leagues want about general broad-based taxes is that the intangible benefits do not accrue to the general broad-based population. They accrue to sports aficionados and sports junkies like me. We're the ones who ought to pay for it. I have no problems with permanent seat licenses. They may not be the fairest, the nicest thing, but they're paid by sports junkies who want to sit in luxurious seating to watch sports. That's great. You're charging the user. We need to get off the broad-based taxes, move to systems like we've tried to implement in a couple of cities, let the sports junkies pay for it, and take this off the table. There's no economic benefit. Those who enjoy sports ought to pay for it, and then the players ought to get as much as they want. Now, the last point that Mr. McKay made about business attraction, don't cities do it all the time? Cities have done an immense number of stupid things, and we have a litany of these kinds of issues, many led by my own community. The issue we try to argue is look at the rates of return and whether it's worth it. Are there some incentives that you can provide to a business that in a sense will generate positive economic returns? Yes. Are there incentives that won't? Absolutely. You ought not do those because in the end, and this is the critical point, it's not that I oppose anything, but in the end, please remember that what creates the ability to have sports, and I am a sports junkie, is the wealth. If you in fact do uneconomic things to attract jobs, you'll lose the wealth that makes sports possible. And if we lose the wealth that makes sports possible, then in effect people like me will be worse off. Sports follows money. It doesn't attract money, never has.
I'd like to ask Mike, since you've done a lot of the work on economic impact of the 96 games on Atlanta, how do you distinguish between that kind of an event and what we've been talking about here with respect to franchises in cities where it's a little bit different? I mean, where in the Atlanta case, you have a one-time event, and it's sold in connection with the common good and of the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta. And I'm wondering, just from your familiarity with the whole project, how has that played out? I mean, has the common good been served?
I think there's a great debate about that. As far as the legacy of the Olympics, there's really been very little. I mean, there's an Olympic stadium, which is no longer an Olympic stadium. It's Turner Field, in which baseball is played. There's a swimming venue at Georgia Tech where there's no major swimming program. As far as facilities, there's really not a whole lot that's left. I think one of the questions I had that we never got around to asking was about corporate sponsorship and corporate sponsorship's ethical role in sports. With the Olympics, they found a lot of corporate sponsors where they had deals where it was a $40 million commitment, and it was IBM, Home Depot, Bank South, emerging companies that were really trying to grow and get their names out there. I guess the question I would have is what role or what responsibilities cities have to solicit or seek the similar corporate sponsorships to build, be it hospitals or schools or zoos or whatever, and what obligations ethically do those same corporations have to seek to put money in more perhaps helpful means, which would be better for society, I guess. I'm not sure how we address that, but that seems to me it's one of the things that struck me from the Atlanta situation, all the money that was raised from these corporations for basically a 2-week event, and yet there's not that commitment in other parts of society. And we'll see Tropicana Field, or we'll see United Arena, or whatever they are, but you see all these corporate names with the arenas, but we don't see it where it could perhaps serve a better purpose.
One of the issues, which I think touches Mike exactly on your point, is that people go criticizing the money they put into schools and things of that nature. I mean, you got to recognize that if you take a look at the median voter who goes out, if they consume sports and they've got an opportunity to vote for a tax package that would lower the cost to them, then their tendency would be to vote for it. If they don't consume schools, because we don't have statewide financing in some areas, so why should I vote for raising my taxes to improve someone else's schools? And so part of what we get here is the fact that you got to recognize that the majority of the people a lot of times who vote, we talked about, in fact, when the vote was here, a lot of the young people did it, they vote because it lowered the price to them. And so, in fact, you got a self-interest problem. When you break out the vote in Cleveland, which we talked about, the vote in Cleveland lost in the city of Cleveland. It won in the Cleveland suburbs. The vote in Denver lost in the city of Denver. It won in the Denver suburbs. And you can really see a pretty direct pattern that those people who perceive that if the tax passes, somebody else will pay for what I get, vote yes. And those who perceive that they will pay for something they won't consume tend to vote no. And so I think that becomes part of this issue about the ethics of how one votes on these kinds of things.
The result in virtually all cases for the hundreds of studies that I have looked at, however, is that public provision of a stadium does not generate sufficient economic benefits to merit the undertaking. The total taxes generated do not cover the costs. The jobs created typically are part-time and low-wage jobs, and the cost per job created is virtually higher than other methods of job creation. Why then the popularity of publicly funded stadiums? Largely because a few powerful vested interests have the potential for very large returns and will keep the embers burning for a stadium. Let me be very careful, however. The economic benefits generally do not support the costs, is the general conclusion. There is one potentially powerful non-pecuniary benefit. What's the value of having the Tampa Bay Devil Rays mentioned in the news throughout the country 162 times a year? Given the potential benefit of that, is it any wonder why chambers of commerce continue to support public stadiums? In some, for stadiums, however, the conclusion is how much is too much.
When St. Louis did the deal, and I said for those of us who work on the side with cities, and I was in the mayor's office in Indianapolis, the net effect of that deal was to cost taxpayers in Indianapolis, as we calculated, probably about $10 or $12 million. Currently, right now, we estimate the cost to state and local governments of the cartels has already passed $11 billion. And if you look at all the new stadium subsidies that are put forward, we may get up as high as $18 billion. And we talk about is too much, too much. You know, it's getting to the point that it's way too much. It's time for both the leagues, the players, the owners, the players, and the taxpayers to recognize that no one's very happy with the current state of affairs. When you have a vote in Dallas, which gets to passes with 50.2, Seattle was 51.5. No vote in the last few years on the stadium issues has been able to get more than 52% of the vote, and several have lost. And so this ought to be a pretty good indication to everybody concerned that we've got a real breakdown in the community. The ethical thing to do would be to try to resolve these kinds of issues. Should, for example, a situation where when the mayor of Houston and the owner in Houston broke down communications, does the owner of the Houston Oilers have an unfair advantage when he knows he can leave and the mayor of Houston has nobody else to deal with? We have an unfair element.
I wouldn't say I'm absolutely against public funding. I think I'm in favor of full revelation of the value of constructing these facilities and spending these public funds, and in clearly setting forth what the alternatives are. If the choice is build a new stadium or provide better public schools, I think people might make the decision towards public schools. I think if you phrase the construction of a new facility like you view the construction of a new public park, highways, a museum, or the like, where there's not a return that you look for, like an investment in a mutual fund, then I think the citizens have a better perspective on what it is they're investing in. The aura that's existed for so long is one that there's going to be a huge economic impact if we build this facility. It's going to bring X millions of dollars to the community. Well, there's a lot of debate about whether or not that's true. I think the academic economists say it's not true, and then if you get people at more of the consulting entities, the response is, oh yes, it is true. But I think the reality is that just tell the citizens what it is they're getting, that it's going to be a nice facility, state-of-the-art. The tickets are going to cost $40 a game. Do you think you can go to that? Do you want to invest in something that you may not be able to go to, that may provide some invigoration for the immediately surrounding neighborhood if there is some presence already, but it's not going to be the panacea that historically it was set out to be.
The values, important consequences, rights and responsibilities of government at times are consistent with the interests of sports. The difficulties arise when the interests of government and sports diverge. Dr. Mark Rosentraub argues that recent votes on the public financing of stadiums shows that communities are split in their support of sports investments. Many communities do not trust sports franchise owners to do public good with public investment. Mike Fish points out that the Olympics in Atlanta left no lasting, tangible value to the community, even after the major public and private investment into the Olympic facilities. He asks, what role should municipalities play in obtaining corporate sponsorships of sporting events? Dr. Richard Sheehan argues that public funding of stadiums are not worth the taxpayers' investments. Studies indicate that stadiums are not the best use of public funds. Kenneth Shropshire, author of the sports franchise game American Cities in Pursuit of Sports Franchises, Stadiums, and Events, maintains that citizens must be fully informed about their public investment choices. Citizens must be made aware that voting for sports venues may take money away from public parks and roads. Public support for private goods may be justified when the interests of the country are served by the product and services of the private businesses. In both economic and government ethics, there are fundamental disputes regarding the appropriateness and viability of putting government money into private enterprises. Government support for sports is one place where public benefits accrue from private actions. But the answer to the question, are the public benefits of sports worth the investment of public dollars, becomes more difficult with the growing popularity of big-time sports.